One of those things certainly is, the very important updates that we're consistently getting from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research that help us understand the world around us quite well. And we are very honored to be joined as we move into our next topic by the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and that's Dr. Vijay Prashad, to talk with us about one of their new, very important texts, Hyper-Imperialism. Vijay, thank you so much for being with us.
It's great to be with you, and I'm so glad that I'm coming to you right after your conversation about that drone base in Agadez, Niger, which I've seen when I traveled through that region, and it's quite interesting because it's on the road, Eugene, to Arlit, where the uranium mines are. So it plays an interesting role, not the least of which as a line of defense, for Europe, because it's actually an anti-migrant base as much as anything. It's very interesting that they located it right there.
That actually is quite interesting.
It's a coincidence, guys. No, it's a coincidence. Stop. You sound like some crazy, kooky conspiracy nuts. They just picked that place because the weather's nice.
Well, it's interesting because it's the last point in Niger, almost the last point in Niger, where migrants from West Africa basically gather in Agadez, get ready to board, mostly white Toyota trucks, and drive through the Sahara to Sabah, Libya. So in fact, it is on the exact route of the migration to Libya and then to Lampedusa. So this town is really significant for that. And I mean, that's precisely why the US has that drone base there. Also, it's really interesting that, you guys followed the killing of US servicemen in Western Niger about 2 years ago. There was a little bit of a scandal. People said, well, we didn't even know there were US troops in Niger. Well, but the US troops are there to basically fight Al-Qaeda, which in that region is largely smugglers. And they smuggle, things like cigarettes. That's a huge market across the Sahara. But they also smuggle people. They smuggle weapons. They smuggle drugs. Cocaine is a big item smuggled through there. And the US government has increased its presence. And when I wrote about this, I mentioned that for the United States and Europe, the European border moved from north of the Mediterranean to south of the Sahara. And when the French developed G5 Sahel, the 5 countries of the Sahel, into this so-called axis, the United States positioned a drone base, the 10-year lease expiring this year, as like manage the arc to stop migration, people going from what Bossel's called the jungle to the garden. There's not much conversation about the role of this base in that regard, in terms of anti-migration and anti-smuggling and so on. I mean, the cocaine story, guys, is for another conversation, because I don't know if you know, it's a major source of Latin American cocaine going through the Sahara back to the United States. Very weird.
Yeah, no, and Guinea-Bissau, of course, right now, a lot of that is playing out in the politics there. But no, very, very, very good point, but a relevant point. The military point that you bring up, Vijay, about hyper-imperialism, I think one of the main things that actually that is laid out in the text, and talk to us about the text, is in fact the role of the U.S. and European this massive military machine in attempting to, keep the thumb on the scale of the entire world.
Well, the first thing to say, which I think is important, is just the numbers. The flagship organization that counts military spending numbers is known as SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute. Well, they've been doing this for many years, and they have a methodology. Part of the methodology is that they accept the numbers that the government gives them. So the United States numbers for the Defense Department is the number for SIPRI. But of course, we know and have known for a very long time that a lot of US military spending is not in the Department of Defense. It's in the Department of Energy. It's in, of course, the Department of Veterans Affairs, because you've got to count, the expenditure on troops who've been injured as part of military spending, because that's what it is. But really, the Department of Energy subsection, which goes to the nuclear weapons program, is considerable. So what the count found when we looked at the actual numbers, it's not near 1 trillion, near 1 trillion, 900 billion or so. It's about 1.53 trillion. It's much more than that. and that increases the quantum of spending of the global north. That is the United States, its NATO partners, and then the NATO plus countries, Republic of Korea, South Korea, Japan, and so on. When you add them all up, the share of global military spending by the United States and its main partners, it's 75% of world spending. Compare that to China at 12%. I mean, it's apples and oranges. And what we, building on that, that's a good factual assessment. And by the way, I would like to offer the researchers at CIPRI to have an open and frank and friendly debate about the numbers, because I think, we would like them to reconsider the way they count US military spending. So this is not a challenge or anything like that. That's not the kind of person I am, but I would like to have an open and friendly debate with them on the numbers that we have come up with. But the implications for this, Eugene, are considerable because, what's interesting? What's interesting is what a CIA bureau chief of Tehran before the revolution told me, Chuck Kogan. He told me, if you have a hammer, and if you have a really big hammer, everything looks like a nail. That means any problem in the world, the first solution isn't going to be diplomacy. It's going to be to hammer it. And this is particularly so of people that the Western countries, the global north, sees as beneath them. So for instance, the government of Yemen made a declaration saying, hey, listen, we want to support the Palestinians. They are undergoing a genocide. So we are going to try to prevent shipping through the Red Sea. And, Rania, if you look at a map, the Red Sea is pretty narrow. So where Yemeni territorial waters go out, it's very hard for ships to actually completely avoid Yemeni territorial waters. That means that the government of Yemen says, we're going to exercise sovereignty. We're going to, hit at ships that are carrying weapons to Israel. If Yemen was any other country, then Antony Blinken or a subordinate would have flown into Sana'a, would have met the political leadership of the Yemeni government, the main political party, Ansar Allah, would have discussed with them, hey, listen, we don't think it's a good idea, global shipping, blah, 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 we don't know what's carrying what, and started a diplomatic conversation. But no, because the global north sees certain countries basically as what an Israeli called human savages, you just hit them immediately. That you have a big hammer and you see them as a nail and bam. Sudan, 1996, the Clinton administration, United States, decided that Sudan had been party to the bombing of the embassies in East Africa, US embassies. Maybe that was true, but there was no visit to Khartoum to go and discuss with the government of Umar al-Bashir what's the situation. Instead, send in missiles and destroy the only factory in Africa that produced drugs for malaria, the Al-Shifa factory. Or Afghanistan, 2001, there's an attack on the United States Pentagon, World Trade Center, and so on. The Taliban government says, we want to negotiate. Here's the white flag of Pali. Can we talk? No. Smack them down. So, this idea, I've just given you 3 examples. If you have a big enough hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And right now, the global north has such a big hammer that it can blow up any bridge in the world, any bridge, but it doesn't know how to build them. It can blow up any bridge, but they're not going to build them. And I think that's an important point, is that the global north right now is able to exercise violence against the world, but it's not able to exercise leadership. And that's why the world is right now scoffing at the United States or France. And that's why the government of Niger says, we need you out of here.
Okay, so Vijay, what you just described sounds very dark and scary. What are the possibilities then, right? Like if we're moving, into an emerging sort of multipolar world where, and not just multipolar, I mean, you have a global south that is starting to create institutions not necessarily can stand up to the imperialism of the global north, but certainly present alternative avenues for dealing in certain ways when it comes to at least like economics, let's say. So what can we look forward to in the present and into the near future, at least in terms of alternatives and ways to counter the very scary forces that you just described?
Well, first, let's recognize that these very scary forces have contradictions. The United States and its allies haven't really won a war in decades. They were defeated in Iraq, defeated in Afghanistan. Libya was hardly a victory. Okay, you blew up the country, and then what did you? You don't dominate it, you don't control it. It was a loss. The Israelis cannot win in Gaza. There's no way. They can destroy all of Gaza, they can kill a lot of Palestinians, but they can't win. Why? Because the global north, including Israel, which is a part of the global north, they don't have a project. They don't have a way to envision their own leadership. They know what they're against, but they're not sure what they are for. You can't win in the world merely by exercising force, domination. What are you for? What do you want to build? They still have the austerity agenda on the table. Nobody wants austerity. But I also don't want to exaggerate. If I'm not exaggerating the as you said, the scary stuff, because there are contradictions there. They just can't win. And I think they realize that, they know that. On the other side, I don't want to exaggerate the emergence of the new. It's very, very much, very early days. They're sort of stumbling. There's a lot of stumbling happening. What we're seeing in the Sahel is one, episode of stumbling. These governments that have come in are trying to, negotiate with each other. There are many landlocked countries. It's hard to manage a landlocked country's economy. They're making various alliances. They're getting threatened. The BRICS bloc is filled with internal contradictions. You have countries that have for decades despised each other. What is Iran and Saudi Arabia going to do despite the handshake agreement in China? How are they going to relate to each other? When you look at even things like the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, which was set up by the Venezuelan government around sanctions, Angola has walked out of that. They are making new deals with the United States around the Lobito corridor to effectively undermine the Democratic Republic of Congo and take out raw materials to a port in Angola. So there's a great stress and strain taking place in the global south. And I'm not prepared to exaggerate the developments. I'm okay with saying there's a new mood in the global south. There's a kind of confidence, a new language. Anwar Ibrahim's extraordinary comment standing next to Olaf Scholz is an example of that. A Malaysian prime minister talking with so much confidence, speaking for the world against the Chancellor of Germany, dismissing the Chancellor of Germany. That's a new mood. I think in Sahel, when they say, French out and then US out and so on, that's part of the new mood. But then what happens tomorrow? What happens after they're out? You just lost $500-600 million, Niger, of US government financing. What happens tomorrow? You're a landlocked country. Who are you going to sell your uranium to? If you're going to sell your uranium to the Russians, how long will your government last? Because the hammer is sitting above your head and it might rest heavily, not only on Agadez, the city of the bases, but on Arlit, which is effectively the uranium base. So we're at a moment of real stresses and strains and unpredictability. And I think for people who want a better world, unpredictability means you got to be wary of your politics. You can't have too many certainties. You have to be ready to tack one way or the other. It's like, I suppose, when you're in a storm in the sea and you have to be careful of where the winds are so your ship doesn't go in the wrong direction. You have to be very aware. So I'm cautious about certainties right now. I think we're not in a moment of certainty. We're in a moment of a great deal of churning, which is the word that we use to describe the world in our dossier from January, which is the churning of the global order.
Yes, well, we'll lash ourselves to the mast so that we are not taken off track by the sirens. But, one of the points I also want to ask you on this point is, we talk so much about a multipolar world, but, are popular movements in and of themselves a pole? Like, we talk about the context so much purely just of states, but I wonder what you think about the role of popular movements and how the world is being shaped.
See, it's very clear that, firstly, let's just say, for the record on this show, that the protest movements taking place in the global north have been extraordinary. The very fact that the Canadian government has said now that they will not supply arms to Israel is a tribute not to Justin Trudeau, who's a weak-kneed, quite pathetic leader of that country. It's a tribute to the people's movement. that has changed the tide in Canada. So, the example of what's happening in Canada, which is really a pretty wretched country, more than 70% of the world's mining companies are domiciled in Canada. So it's not like it's some liberal paradise, okay? These are vicious mining companies like Barrick Gold and so on, all domiciled in Canada. But Canada, because of this popular pressure, has had to basically reconsider its full-throated support for Israel. I think that's a very good example for people around the world. But let's look now at the global south briefly. Take the case of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and so on. The people who've come to power in these countries, the young officers who are in power, Ibrahim Kote and others, they play an important role. They have a certain understanding of what they don't want. But it's not yet clear that they have an understanding of what they want. What's the agenda on the table? For a lot of time in the 20th century, from the coup of Abdul Karim Qasim in Iraq in 1958, to, in fact, the later coups in Africa in the 1960s and 70s, many of these military people that came to power, and Qasim is a good example, they didn't know what to do the day after. They knew what they were coupping. They were against that government. But what happens tomorrow? Qasim turns to the Iraqi Communist Party and says, please give me a hand. And that's exactly what they did. So in that sense, I mean, what I'm trying to say in a sort of roundabout way is that the movements play a very important role laying out an agenda for these countries where a new mood has begun to set in. You can't allow Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia. You can't allow the South African government led by Ramaphosa. You can't allow the military in Niger to set the terms, because in a sense, they are yesterday's thinkers. They think about the agenda from yesterday's point of view. They now know that they are against austerity and that they are against, United States interference in their politics, but they don't know what they should be for. And that's where the movements come in. That's what the movements put on the agenda. The movements are going to have to say that we need you immediately to basically help us transcend the everyday needs of people. We need electricity. We need, literacy. We need better medical care. We need to no longer be hungry. Things like that have to be on the agenda. And then new leaders will appear, or maybe the old leaders will transform themselves. Maybe Mr. Museveni in Uganda will figure out that he used to be a Marxist in his youth, a student of Walter Rodney in Tanzania. Maybe Museveni will say miraculously, okay, I reject the austerity agenda. He's been saying some pretty radical things around the wars in the world these days. But what if these people or new people emerge saying, we need an agenda where the wealthy bondholders sitting in the West shouldn't be the first beneficiaries of our wealth, but the first beneficiaries of our wealth should be our own people. So how are you going to deal with the wealthy bondholders? Are you prepared for a frontal fight? Is there going to be a block of countries joining together to contest the immense burden of debt on the African continent, as per example? So that's the role the movements have to play, because we know these new leaders, we know that they are against yesterday, but we also know that they don't know what tomorrow will look like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, as always, Vijay, it is a pleasure to have you here. I hope everyone checks out Hyper-Imperialism, which you can see at the website of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, in PDF form as well, so you can print it out and read it in hard copy, which you can also get as well. Vijay Prashad, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Always a pleasure to be on the Freedom Side.